What an honor it is to be here. I have known John Hope Bryant for almost 25 years, when Operation Hope was little more than a glint in his eye, just this little organization with huge aspirations. So it is a great honor and privilege for me to be here to see what it has become. I'm proud for John, I am proud of John, and I am deeply proud to be his friend. John has asked me today to talk about Lyndon Baines Johnson, our 36th president, who is, I think, rightfully known as the civil rights president, as an exemplar of somebody who used power with purpose. And I'll start with a story. Everybody who knew LBJ has some story about this larger-than-life character. And one of my favorites comes from a staffer when LBJ was in the Senate. LBJ was the all-powerful Senate majority leader, and he was going back home to his home state, my home state of Texas, to campaign for re-election. And he asked his speechwriters to draft a stump speech that he would take around the state. So he convened his speechwriters, and he read this draft of the speech that they had written. And he stumbled on a quote from the Greek philosopher Socrates. And he said, Socrates, let me get this straight. I'm going back to Texas to talk to just plain folks, and you have me quoting Socrates? He said, keep the quote, but start it with, my daddy always used to say. LBJ's daddy always used to say that power is nothing without purpose. On November 22nd, on the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and the presidency was thrust on Lyndon Johnson accidentally, LBJ came from Dallas back to Washington, and he spent all night awake drafting the agenda for what would become the Great Society. And it included civil rights and poverty eradication and education for all. It essentially was about equaling the playing field. He knew the importance of what government could do to help the plight of those who had been left behind, and he intended to use his presidency to equal the playing field in every way he could. One of the things he did very soon after the assassination is he reached out to leaders who mattered throughout the country, including, in one case, a 34-year-old civil rights leader in this town named Martin Luther King. This is a conversation that occurred 3 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, on the day that President Kennedy was buried in Washington. LBJ retired to his vice presidential office in the old executive office building next to the White House, and he called leaders, including King. This is a fraction of that conversation.
I won't tell you how grateful I am and how worthy I'm going to try to be of all your hopes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to hear that, and I knew that you had just that great spirit, and you know you have our support and backing.
Well,
we know what a difficult period this is.
It's just an impossible period. We got a budget coming up that's we got nothing to do with it. It's practically already made, and we got a civil rights bill that hadn't even passed the House, and it's November, and Hubert Humphrey told me yesterday everybody wanted to go home. We got a tax bill that they haven't touched, and we just got to not let up on any of them and keep going. And I guess they'll say that I'm repudiated, but I'm going to ask the Congress Wednesday to just stay there till they pass them all. They won't do it, but we'll just keep them there next year till they do, and we just won't give up an inch.
Well, this is mighty fine. I think it's so imperative. I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate.
Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now.
Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything.
And so began one of the great partnerships of the 20th century. They worked together, yes. These two men worked together to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One of the important planks in that legislation was a potent voting rights plank. And LBJ deliberately stripped it out, not because he didn't believe fervently in voting rights, but because he had an instinctive sense of what a reluctant Congress would be willing to pass. So LBJ looked at civil rights incrementally. Break the back of Jim Crow first, he believed, and its false promise of separate but equal laws, and then find a crisis that you can use to get voting rights through Congress. He used the martyrdom of John F. Kennedy to pass the Civil Rights Act, but he waited to figure out an opportunity for voting rights to go through. The next conversation I'm going to play between these two gentlemen comes on January 15th, 1965, on what was Dr. King's 36th birthday. And you can hear in this conversation the symbiotic partnership between these two giant men as they strategize on how they're going to get voting rights through, how they're going to exploit the opportunity to get that through, again, a once again reluctant Congress. Here's that conversation.
It's so important to get Negroes registered to vote in large numbers in the South, and it will be this coalition of the Negro vote and the moderate white vote that will really make the new South.
You can contribute a great deal by getting your leaders and you yourself taking very simple examples of discrimination, where a man's got to memorize Longfellow, whether he's got to quote the first 10 amendments, or he's got to tell you what Amendment 15, 16, 17 is, and then ask them if they know, and show what happens. And some people don't have to do that, but when a Negro comes in, he's got to do it. And if we can just repeat and repeat and repeat, and if you can find the worst condition that you run into in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana, or South Carolina, and if you just take that one illustration and get it on radio and get it on television and get it on in the pulpits, get it in the meetings, get it every place you can, pretty soon the fellow that didn't do anything but drive a tractor, he'll say, well, that's not right, that's not fair. And then that will help us on what we're going to shove through in the end.
Yeah, you're exactly right about that.
And if we do that, we will break through as it'll be the greatest breakthrough of anything, not even except in this 64 Act. I think the greatest achievement of my administration, I think the greatest achievement in foreign policy, I said to a group yesterday, was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But I think this will be bigger.
You can hear in that conversation President Johnson urging Dr. King to wage the movement to expose the American people to the racial injustices that were systemic in our nation. He knew that if you showed people what was happening, they wouldn't stand for it. As he says in that conversation, which is so vivid to me, and it shows President Johnson's faith in the American people. If you show the American people that voting injustice, that suppression, there isn't a fellow who doesn't do anything all day but drive a tractor who will say that isn't right, that isn't fair. So Dr. King and his followers waged their movement. In the meantime, LBJ pushed his very prodigious agenda well beyond civil rights. Like Dr. King, he saw education, poverty eradication, and economic opportunity as fundamental building blocks in what Dr. King would have called the beloved society. So as he's waiting for this opportunity to push voting rights, he's getting through, in 1 year, in 1 year, 1965, he's seeing to the creation of Head Start, to the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, of the Office of Economic Opportunity, the creation of NPR and PBS, federal aid to education for the first time in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act. This is 1 year, folks. LBJ wanted to level the playing field. He wanted to give not only a handout when it was appropriate, but a hand up. Meantime, we had what is infamously now known as Bloody Sunday occur on March 7th, 1965. You can see here civil rights marchers led by the great John Lewis walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they were met by Alabama state troopers who roundly put that march down brutally. And this scene played out over the airwaves in the United States of America. And there was the outraged conscience of a nation that ensued. LBJ now had his opportunity to push through voting rights. And he didn't hesitate to address the American people. A week after Bloody Sunday, he came before them, a joint session of Congress and the American people, to press for voting rights legislation. As with the martyrdom of John F. Kennedy, he let no good crisis go to waste. This is a passage from that speech, and it shows a formative experience in Lyndon Johnson's life that I think gives you a clue into why he had such passion for social reform.
My first job after college was as a teacher in Cotulla, Texas, in a small Mexican-American school. Few of them could speak English, and I couldn't speak much Spanish. My students were poor, and they often came to class without breakfast, hungry. And they knew, even in their youth, the pain of prejudice. They never seemed to know why people disliked them, but they knew it was so, because I saw it in their eyes. I often walked home late in the afternoon after the classes were finished, wishing there was more that I could do. But all I knew was to teach them the little that I knew, hoping that it might help them against the hardships that lay ahead. And somehow you never forget what poverty and hatred can do when you see its scars on the hopeful face of a young child. I never thought then, in 1928, that I would be standing here in 1965. It never even occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and daughters of those students and to help people like them all over this country. But now I do have that chance. And I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it.
And use it he did. The most indelible part of that speech came next, when LBJ invoked very consciously the phrase from the anthem of the civil rights movement. Here's that passage.
So I ask you to join me in working long hours, and nights, and weekends if necessary, to pass this bill. And I don't make that request lightly. Far from the window where I sit with the problems of our country, I recognize that from outside this chamber is the outraged conscience of a nation, the grave concern of many nations, and the harsh judgment of history on our acts. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
We shall overcome. When LBJ used that phrase, he said to people who were on the front lines of the movement, who used that song as an anthem to get them through the trials and tribulations that they faced, that the president himself had heard their cries and was willing to use the power of his office to do something about it. John Lewis watched that speech with Dr. King in Selma. And when LBJ invoked that phrase, "We shall overcome," John Lewis saw Dr. King cry for the first time. And as a tear rolled down his cheek, he said, "We shall march from Selma to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act will pass." Several days later, John Lewis and Martin Luther King and the great Andrew Young marched from Selma to Montgomery, and LBJ ensured passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. LBJ used the power that was given to him to do, in his words, the greatest good for the greatest number. Power without purpose, he knew, is like life without love, a hollow experience, a missed opportunity, a promise unfulfilled. My favorite story about LBJ goes back to before the Civil Rights Act was signed. LBJ knew if he were to pass the Civil Rights Act, he would have been defying the very politicians from the South who helped him to ascend to power in the House and in the Senate. Those people who had ensured that he would climb up the ladder to become the Senate Minority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, Vice President, and ultimately the President of our nation. Among those standing in the way was a giant senator from this state, Georgia. His name was Richard Russell. He was a friend and a mentor to LBJ. And out of respect for Richard Russell, LBJ invited him to the White House to make clear his intention to put the Civil Rights Act through Congress. And he said, when he invited him to the Oval Office, he said, "Dick, I'm going to have to run over you. This time, we're going to get a civil rights bill through Congress, and it's going to mean something. It's going to liberate a people. But I warn you, when I do that, I'm going to run over you and all those who are standing in my way." Richard Russell said, "Mr. President, I believe you can do that. I don't believe John F. Kennedy could have done that, but I believe that you can. But I will warn you, if you do it, you risk losing the Democratic Party to the Republicans in the South, and you risk losing the presidency in your own right when you run for office later this year." And LBJ, this paragon of power, who had spent his whole life toward the acquisition and exercise of power, heard his old friend and mentor and replied, "Dick, if that is the price for this bill, I will gladly pay it." That is power with purpose. And that is political courage that we could stand to see today. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for letting me be here. Thank you.